Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rosa and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. As always, my name is Manas Chawla, and I'm joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. And this week, we're talking about American domestic politics taking center stage once again, with all of its ramifications, both domestic and international. Last week, we, had the much anticipated U.S. midterms. It's always funny to me how quickly the American political cycle moves because you're either worrying about the midterms, and as soon as those are done, you're worrying about the next presidential election, the primaries for that. But we had the midterms and we got some interesting results. Brunello, what are the top line updates that listeners should take away from these midterms?
So they have been widely reported, although belatedly, I would say, because somehow it takes a long time for the Americans to process their election results, also because they have to wait for the postal vote, then there's the recounting, even if in theory it's kind of mostly automated systems, it does take some time to get to the final results. So what is it that we have learned so far? First of all, in the Senate, the Democrats have kept the majority. They have at least 50 seats. If they manage to win the runoff elections in Georgia, they may reach 51, which means they don't need the casting vote of Kamala Harris, the vice president and president and speaker of the Senate, in order to pass legislation. And it is also very important that they retain the control of the Senate, because the Senate is where the nominations of the presidents are approved. And is also the chamber that eventually judges on impeachment trials. The House of Representatives instead has changed hands and now is in control of the Republicans, which have now got achieved a small majority compared to the 218 required. Initially, seems that there would be a sort of red avalanche or red wave sort of sweeping victory both at the House and Senate. In reality, the Senate remains the Democrats and the House passed to Republicans, but only by a very, very small margin, not enough to really create troubles to Biden. In particular, I mentioned the possibility of impeaching him in theory for his conduct of the Ukrainian war and the links of his son Hunter to the previous Ukrainian government. And the articles of impeachment might be written, passed by the House, but then they will go to the Senate and they will go absolutely nowhere. So it's even a judgment called by the Republicans on whether to embark in such a abrasive procedure that will lead to absolutely nowhere.
Right, and I mean, the sort of perhaps a bigger question as we head into the next election cycle is whether Joe Biden will run again for president. In effect, he's seen by lots of people as much more moderate, much more better than Trump. Doesn't have all that brashness, but at the same time, doesn't have the dynamism that Obama or say other members of the Democratic Party are known for. How do Republicans and Democrats feel about that, about Biden running again?
So it's once we have discussed Congress, now it's turn of the presidential election, which is only 2 years away, and the political cycle in the US is super fast. As you can see, every 2 years there's an election where there's a full change of one of the two branches of Congress, or only partial, and then as soon as that is done, then it's again presidential election. So a very fast cycle. Until recently, it seemed like Biden was very undecided on whether to run or not. He was really waiting for the result of the elections, and with these kind of encouraging results, he would probably decide to run again. Clearly, the Democrats might need to have some sort of plan B, because if Trump runs again and is now formally announcing the primary, but let's say he wins the primary, which needs to be seen, but let's assume it does, then Biden, I think, has a chance of beating Trump once again. But if the Republicans choose a younger, more energetic, less abrasive candidate, such as DeSantis from Florida, then potentially choosing a bit of a let's call it very experienced politician, like definitely not fresh face like Biden might not be the best choice. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg situation there on the decision. Clearly, a sitting president has most of the time the greatest chances of being re-elected. So in my opinion, he will decide to run again, irrespective of whether it's going to be Trump or somebody else in the opposite camp.
Right. And even if ideally Democrats would want to make a choice on whether or not Biden runs again, they'd have to make that before the Republicans do, before the primaries conclude. So they don't really have a choice. I think the real question is that people sort of around the world are watching for is the longer Biden delays making that announcement, what could the reasons sort of for that be, and does that say anything about his health, and et cetera, et cetera. But
exactly.
That's an interesting discussion, but so is we talk about American domestic politics, but there's that line I really like: when America sneezes, the world catches a flu. And American domestic politics, really do have international ramifications. You pointed out in this week's newsletter something specific about how they sort of impacted the war in Ukraine. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, as we discussed, the presidential election is always huge international ramification. Generally, when there's a change of wind, so to speak, in Washington, it tends to happen in other parts of the world, in particular in Western Europe, where the climate is much more sensitive to what happens in DC. But it's not just the electoral wave that can change, it's the behavior of Americans' enemies that can change. In Ukraine, for example, it was pretty clear that his withdrawal from Kherson was completed and potentially even decided after it was clear that Biden would have won, which means that the administration will continue to provide weapons to the Ukrainian army, which means that the fight will be still long and hard, which means that as well, the Russian army needs to stay on positions that they can credibly defend, and being behind a huge river such as Dnipro really makes a difference. If instead they had the impression that the new president would be elected in a couple of years, they can easily resist a couple of years, because in our, so to speak, Western timing, 2 years is an eternity, but Russia is used to this kind of long-term fights, wars, occupation. Let's not forget Afghanistan, but more recently in Syria. Let's not forget Chechnya. So they can stay there for a couple of years easily, not necessarily attacking with the same violence, the same brutality every day. They can have periods in which the war subsides and then restarts again, waiting for the new boss in the US, so to speak, to come to power. But now that they understand the potential, it's not going to be any new boss. They understood that this very hard-fought war would continue. Now, Biden himself is calling Zelensky, try to make him a bit more reasonable, so to speak, trying to convince him that potentially we might need to accept some sort of peace that doesn't necessarily entail the total freeing of Ukraine. Some territories might, in fact, end up being given to Russia, so to speak, that will speed up the peace process. Zelensky clearly still not listening from that ear, not just because he's stubborn, but because he says, look, if you legitimize Putin as a kind of credible counterpart in this discussion, then first of all, it's very hard to go back to him and say, look, what you did was illegal, was brutal, was whatever, because you signed a peace treaty. And secondly, if he is there 1 year, 2 years, 3 years from now, he might start again from this newly acquired position. So it is not totally unreasonable, the position of Zelensky, although some people would like him to accept that some parts of the Ukrainian territories are lost. It's not just a question of pride, but it's also a question of making sure that the war doesn't restart 2 years, 3 years from now.
Right. I mean, they're not purely simply reputational concerns. The reputational concerns drive the strategic aspects of how you sort of negotiate in the optics of it. That the optics are particularly important in this situation, perhaps more than they were in previous wars, with the entire world's eyes on Ukraine. But the sort of the upcoming primaries and who's president will obviously have a big impact on that, and that's why we'll continue to watch how American domestic politics has these international ramifications. As always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Until next time.